It's a novel. It's a work of fiction. It's an entirely imagined life of an African woman in the 18th century, and it's told in her voice. But it sits on a bedrock of historical research. So the greater historical lines underneath this story are meticulously researched. Her personal life is my invention. So it's a historical novel, truly. It's a work of fiction, but it involves history. So I'd like to share with you three of the most interesting historical undercurrents to this novel. The first is that, really, why don't I go in chronological order? I know that it's hard to grow up in the United States and not to know that the first person to die in the American Revolutionary War was an African American by the name of Crispus Attucks, who was, of course, serving on the side of the rebels. We know this in Canada as well, but very few Canadians, and I would venture to say few Americans are aware that while some African Americans chose to serve on the side of the victorious rebels, many chose to serve on the side of the British. Well, why would they do so? The British issued two public proclamations, formal edicts issued by the most senior British military commanders to African Americans of the day, saying basically, flee your plantations, profit from the chaos of the Revolutionary War, come behind British lines and serve us. And if you serve us during the war, we will free you and guarantee your security and liberty after the war. As a result, thousands of blacks did exactly that. They fled the chains of enslavement and they served the British during the war. Many went to Charleston, South Carolina, which was also a hotbed of British power during much of the Revolution, but even more came to Manhattan. And this very city was indeed the most significant British point of control and command during the war. It was the one place that the British held for all but 6 months of the Revolutionary War. So thousands of African Americans found themselves in the southern tip of Manhattan during the war in service to the British. Men and women served as cooks, road builders, spies, soldiers, prostitutes, midwives, you name it. They did it with their children in tow, in service of all sorts imaginable to the British. When the war ended, and the British signed a peace treaty ceding defeat in organizing to pull out of Manhattan over a 6-month time period in 1783. You can well imagine the terror that lay in the hearts of the African Americans who'd served the losers in the American Revolution. What was to become of them? They'd served the British. They had fought against and served against the very people who claimed to own them, the very same people who were just about to retake Manhattan. What was to become of these thousands of African Americans stuck in Manhattan, not able to leave? The island, of course, was highly policed. You couldn't leave unless you were permitted to. As it turns out, the British decided to evacuate 3,000 blacks who'd served them in the war, who could establish that they had served the British for at least 1 year behind these lines. So it came to be that as they were preparing to leave, if you could establish, if you were African American, that you'd served the British for a year, you would have your name entered into a document kept by the British military, and it was known as the Book of Negroes. This document is the first time in the history of the United States that thousands of African Americans are formally documented. You find their name, their age, where they came from in the United States, how they came to flee slavery, who used to claim to own them. It even offers a short, pithy, often painful and rude physical description of the person in question. There are 3,000 names in this Book of Negroes. Each page is about this big. You can find the Book of Negroes in the New York Public Library. I've seen it there myself, the main branch. You can also find it in Colonial Williamsburg and in the National Archives. It's also available in archives in Canada and the originals in London, England. The Book of Negroes looks like this. There's a photocopy of a tiny piece of one of the pages of the Book of Negroes. It's 150 pages in length in the front page of this book, and there's one at the back page of the book as well. It's a very important document because it allows genealogists and historians to track the movement of African Americans back and forth in time, prior to their involvement in the Revolutionary War, usually in the American South, and after the war when they fled. Most of the blacks who served the British during the war in Manhattan and fled at the end of the war sailed to Nova Scotia, Canada, which was a 9-day trip by ship. A few of them went to Germany. A few of them went to England. A handful went to the Caribbean, but almost all, over 95%, went to Nova Scotia, Canada. Some of them were traveling free, and they were described as traveling on their own bottom, which was another term for free. Some of them were indentured servants, and others were the slaves, and were slaves. And ironically and terribly, the British were both the liberators and the enslavers of African Americans. On one hand, they liberated some of them and they sent them free to Nova Scotia. On the other hand, British officers carried their property with them. Blacks who they claimed to own brought them with them as their slaves and took them as slaves to Nova Scotia, Canada, and kept them enslaved in Nova Scotia. So they offered a double-edged sword, freedom for some, slavery for others. All of them are entered into the Book of Negroes. The African Americans who come to Nova Scotia meet with the most horrendous oppression imaginable, which I think is really akin to the worst of Southern plantation slavery. They meet with slavery, they meet with segregation, they meet with anti-black race riots, they meet with laws of segregation which are highly punitive in nature. And after really, they vote with their feet. After 10 years of miserable treatment in Nova Scotia, Canada, broken promises, I guess, are the worst of the miserable treatment. They were promised land and food and tools in exchange for service to the British during the war. Most of them got none of it. So after 10 years of these broken promises, they leave. They accept an offer from the British government to travel on a voluntary basis from Halifax, Nova Scotia, to found the colony of Freetown in Sierra Leone. 1792, 1,200 African Americans accept the offer from the British. That is to say, about a third of those who fled Manhattan and came to Nova Scotia turn around and leave, and they go on a voluntary basis to Sierra Leone. This is so interesting and so significant and almost entirely forgotten. Why is 1792 so interesting? Well, first of all, it is the height of the transatlantic slave trade. Thousands upon thousands of Africans are still being brought into the chains of slavery in Canada, the United States, the Caribbean, and South America at this very time. And yet these 1,200 men and women with their children are sailing in 15 unarmed, puny vessels to Freetown. It's also significant because it's an earlier point of departure to Africa than most of us are aware of. Most of us have heard of Marcus Garvey, who in the early 1900s from Jamaica is urging a back to Africa doctrine. Many of us have heard that Americans founded the colony of Liberia in West Africa in the early 1800s. But more than a century before Marcus Garvey is urging his back to Africa doctrine, and decades before the Americans found the colony of Liberia in West Africa, the first back to Africa migration of African Americans from this continent is in 1792 from Halifax, going to found the colony of Freetown. My character, Aminata Diallo, is drawn into this entire transatlantic migration. She's born in Mali, a landlocked country in West Africa. She's sent over in the Middle Passage to the Sea Islands of South Carolina, where she serves as a midwife and on an indigo plantation growing indigo, from which one extracts the color blue that one associates these days with blue jeans, which was very much in demand in England. She gets to Charleston, then she travels to New York to serve the British during the war, where she frees herself, and then she travels to Nova Scotia and ultimately back to Africa. This idea that some African peoples were enslaved and liberated, brought across the ocean twice in the same lifetime, is almost hard to believe, but it actually happens to be true. And so my story sits on this bedrock of real history, but my character, Aminata, is invented, and her life story is my creation. So that's a bit of the history that supports the novel.